The autumn storm of 1308 swept across the Atlantic approaches to Scotland with the fury of a season turning dark. In the deep waters beyond the Hebridean archipelago, vessels bearing no identifying marks rode the swells northward, their sails strained taut against winds that had carried them from the coast of France. These were not merchant ships making routine passages between continental ports. According to fragmentary maritime records examined by maritime historians, the vessels navigating toward the Scottish western seaboard in the months following October 1307 represented something unprecedented, a displaced military order seeking refuge beyond the reach of papal authority and French royal power. The sequence of events that compelled this desperate migration had begun with mechanical precision on October 13th of the previous year. At dawn on that Friday, royal officers across the Kingdom of France executed sealed orders distributed weeks earlier by King Philip IV. Within hours, approximately 1,500 Knights Templar, warrior monks who had defended Christendom in the Holy Land for nearly 2 centuries, found themselves imprisoned, their vast network of commanderies and preceptories seized, their legendary treasury vanished. The charges read against them invoked heresy, blasphemy, and practices so shocking that chroniclers struggled to record them. Yet historical analysis of trial documents reveals the accusations originated not from religious conscience, but from royal bankruptcy. Philip owed the Templars sums his treasury could not repay. The diplomatic context of 1307 to 1308 created a unique configuration of circumstances. Pope Clement V, installed at Avignon under French influence, initially protested the arrests as violations of papal jurisdiction over religious orders. His bull Pastoralis Praeeminentiae of November 1307 commanded all Christian monarchs to arrest Templars within their territories and confiscate properties. But the decree carried weight only where papal authority functioned. In Scotland, that authority had collapsed. King Robert Bruce, crowned in March 1306 after murdering his rival John Comyn before the altar at Greyfriars Church in Dumfries, stood excommunicated for sacrilege. The papal interdict placed upon his kingdom meant that Scotland existed outside the ecclesiastical legal structure that bound the rest of Christendom. For Templars fleeing France, this created sanctuary. Bruce, consolidating power through brilliant guerrilla warfare against both English occupation forces and Scottish rivals, needed experienced military professionals. The convergence of Templar desperation and Bruce's military requirements established conditions for what medieval chroniclers later described in cryptic marginalia as the arrival of brothers from across the sea. The maritime journey from La Rochelle to Scotland's western coast required approximately 2 weeks under favorable conditions. According to reconstructions based on medieval ship capabilities and Atlantic weather patterns, autumn crossings were hazardous. Medieval vessels designed primarily for coastal navigation in Mediterranean conditions sat low in the water with shallow drafts unsuited to Atlantic swells. Navigators relied on dead reckoning, celestial observation, and intimate knowledge of coastal landmarks. Ships departing French Atlantic ports would have sailed north past Brittany, keeping the coast in sight until reaching Cornwall, then crossing the Irish Sea toward the western approaches of Scotland. The Sound of Jura, that narrow passage between the islands of Jura and the Scottish mainland, provided the primary navigational corridor into Argyll's protected waters. Medieval maritime practice favored such sheltered routes over open ocean passages. Ships entering the Sound would have encountered a landscape of profound remoteness. Steep hillsides descending to dark water, minimal settlement, terrain offering concealment. The lordship of Argyll in 1308 remained fragmented among competing clan powers, none strong enough to challenge rivals who brought military expertise and resources. Castle Sween, standing on the eastern shore of Loch Sween in Knapdale, represented one of the oldest stone fortifications on the Scottish mainland. Its position commanding approaches from the sea made it a natural landfall for vessels seeking protected anchorage. Archaeological analysis of the castle's construction phases indicates modifications to its defensive structures during the early 14th century, additions consistent with the arrival of personnel trained in advanced fortification techniques developed during Crusader campaigns in the Levant. The date of landfall cannot be established with certainty. What exists are patterns, gaps in documentary records, archaeological anomalies, and the physical evidence of graves that appear in locations where they should not. marked by symbols their carvers dared not explain. To comprehend what arrived on Scotland's shores in 1308 requires understanding what the Knights Templar had become during their 2-century existence. Founded around 1119 in Jerusalem by French knight Hugues de Payens and 8 companions, the order began with a stated mission of protecting Christian pilgrims traveling dangerous roads to the Holy Land. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem granted them quarters atop the Temple Mount, in the complex built over ruins traditionally identified as Solomon's Temple. From this association came their name, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ, and of the Temple of Solomon. The transformation from 9 impoverished knights to medieval Europe's most powerful military financial institution occurred with remarkable speed. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, Pope Honorius II granted official recognition. Bernard of Clairvaux, the era's most influential churchman, composed their rule and wrote, in praise of the new knighthood, declaring Templars a new kind of warrior, monks who killed without sin in defense of faith. Papal bulls granted extraordinary privileges, exemption from local taxes and laws, freedom to cross all borders, spiritual authority answerable only to Rome. They became the first truly international organization since the Roman Empire. By the mid-12th century, Templars operated across Christendom. Their network included over 870 commanderies, preceptories, and fortified holdings stretching from Jerusalem to London. They developed sophisticated financial instruments, letters of credit allowing pilgrims to deposit funds at one location and withdraw them elsewhere, encrypted with codes only Templar officials could verify. This banking system generated enormous wealth, which the order used to finance military operations and expand holdings. At their height, Templars controlled properties equivalent to a modern multinational corporation, including farms, vineyards, mills, and entire ports. Scotland's connection to the order began early. Hugh de Payens visited in 1128, meeting King David I, who granted the order lands in Midlothian, establishing the preceptory at Ballintrodoch, later renamed Temple, as their Scottish headquarters. Over subsequent decades, Templar presence expanded across southern and eastern Scotland, with documented holdings in at least 9 counties. They administered estates, collected revenues, recruited members, and participated in the kingdom's ecclesiastical and military affairs. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the end of Crusader presence in the Holy Land, leaving military orders without their original purpose. Proposals circulated for merging Templars and Hospitallers, for launching new crusades, for redirecting resources toward other frontiers. None materialized. Meanwhile, King Philip II of France faced bankruptcy from wars with England and Flanders. His attempts to debase currency and seize church property made him enemies among clergy and commons alike. The Templar order, headquartered in Paris, represented an irresistible target: vast wealth, political independence, and military force that, if turned against him, could threaten his throne. The charges assembled against the Templars were calibrated to ensure no Christian monarch could defend them. Accusations included denying Christ, spitting on the cross during initiation ceremonies, worshipping an idol called Baphomet, engaging in sodomy, and conducting secret rituals. Under torture, strappado, burning feet, rack, and techniques refined by the Inquisition, men confessed to anything. Historical analysis reveals profound contradictions in testimonies. Different prisoners described different initiation rites. The idol Baphomet was variously described as a head, a cat, a bearded figure, or formless. Geographic details in confessions contradicted known locations of Templar ceremonies. What remains historically verified, on March 22, 1312, Pope Clement V issued the Bull Vox in Excelso, officially dissolving the Knights Templar. Properties were to transfer to the Knights Hospitaller, though in practice much was seized by European monarchs. In France, hundreds of Templars burned at the stake or died in imprisonment. Grand Master Jacques de Molay endured 7 years of imprisonment and torture before being executed in Paris in March 1314. Yet the records reveal a pattern. In territories beyond Philip's direct control, Portugal, Germanic states, the Iberian Peninsula, and critically Scotland, enforcement was sporadic or non-existent. In Scotland particularly, where King Robert Bruce stood excommunicated and fought for his kingdom's independence against England, papal authority meant little. The few Templar properties in Scotland were nominally transferred to the Hospitallers, but the knights themselves seem to have vanished from official records without arrests, trials, or executions. They simply ceased to be Templars in name while remaining present in fact. A transformation documented not in royal chronicles, but in archaeological evidence, architectural modifications, symbols carved into stone, and graves marked only by swords. The systematic investigation of Scotland's potential role as Templar refuge began not in archives but on windswept hillsides of Argyll, where stone slabs weathered by centuries lay in medieval graveyards. During the 19th century, antiquarians cataloging Scottish medieval monuments noted peculiar characteristics of grave markers at sites throughout the Western Highlands. At Kilmartin, Kilmurray, Keels, Kilberry, and locations across the islands of Giga and Islay, researchers encountered concentrations of carved stone slabs displaying a recurring pattern. Austere memorials marked only by incised swords, bearing no inscriptions, no heraldic devices, no family affiliations. The contrast with typical medieval Scottish burial practices was striking. Grave slabs of the 13th and 14th centuries typically featured elaborate carvings, figures of knights in contemporary dress, clan symbols, sea galleys indicating maritime connections, inscriptions identifying the deceased and their lineages. But the sword-marked graves displayed none of these elements. They were anonymous, deliberately so. The swords carved upon them were single-handed weapons, depicted with specific details, crossguard configurations, pommel styles, blade proportions, that corresponded to designs documented in military inventories from the early 14th century. Modern archaeological analysis employing radiocarbon dating of organic materials and stratigraphic examination of burial contexts established timeframes for these graves. Results consistently returned to dates between 1310 and 1350, precisely the period following the Templar dissolution in 1312. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted at sites including Kilmartin revealed burial patterns indicating military personnel of significant status. Yet none appeared in documentary records. No wills, no property transfers, no entries in burgh registers. They were buried with honor, but without official recognition. Ghosts in the historical record. The discovery that transformed speculation into serious historical inquiry occurred in 2016, when maintenance work at Temple in Midlothian, the former Templar headquarters in Scotland, uncovered carved stone slabs incorporated into later wall foundations. Archaeological documentation revealed characteristics matching the Argyll graves, anonymous sword markers, early 14th century dating, deliberate removal from original contexts. The stones had been repurposed, their inscriptions and symbolism deemed either irrelevant or too sensitive to remain visible. Analysis of carving techniques suggested the work of skilled masons familiar with military iconography. The swords were not generic representations but specific weapon types. Crossguards with swollen tips, protruding central langets along blades, pommels reflecting transitional designs between Viking low-batted forms and later rounded types. These details matched weapons documented in Templar armories and illustrated in manuscripts associated with the order. The precision of execution indicated professionals applying specialized knowledge. Comparative studies revealed similar anonymous sword graves at locations throughout Scotland wherever Templar presence was suspected. At Rosslyn, at Mary Coulter in Aberdeenshire, at sites throughout Midlothian and the borders. The pattern was too consistent to represent coincidence. Physical evidence confirmed a continued military presence with Templar characteristics, while documentary sources maintained conspicuous silence. Examination of ecclesiastical records provided additional context. Monastic cartularies, registers recording property transactions, legal agreements, and significant events, displayed suspicious discontinuities. At Scottish abbeys with known Templar connections, including Melrose and Holyrood, folios covering years 1307, 1320 were missing. The pages had not deteriorated with age. They had been cut from bindings with deliberate precision. Stub edges remained visible, showing where parchment was removed. These gaps corresponded exactly to the period when Templar refugees would have been most active in Scotland. Royal records presented similar anomalies. Scottish exchequer rolls documenting crown revenues, showed incomplete entries for properties that should have generated income, including former Templar estates officially transferred to the Knights Hospitaller. Yet evidence from later periods confirmed these properties remained productive, suggesting revenue was collected but not recorded, or recorded in registers subsequently destroyed. The significance of these discoveries lies not in individual findings, but in their cumulative pattern. Multiple independent lines of evidence, archaeological, architectural, documentary, converge on the same conclusion. Something happened in Scotland between 1307 and 1350, involving personnel with Templar training, something significant enough that multiple generations of record keepers felt compelled to conceal it. The physical traces they left, graves, buildings, symbols carved into stone, survived despite deliberate attempts at erasure. Modern forensic historiography treats these absences as evidence in themselves. The pattern of suppression reveals what official history sought to hide: that the Templars reached Scotland, that they were absorbed into its military and religious structures, and that powerful interests worked to ensure this absorption left minimal traces in the documentary record. Reconstructing the timeline of Templar arrival in Scotland requires assembling fragments from sources never meant to be connected. The process begins with Jean de Chalon's testimony during the Paris trials of 1308. Under interrogation, de Chalon claimed that Gérard de Villiers, preceptor of the Paris Temple, had been warned of impending arrests and fled the city with 50 horses. According to de Chalon, 18 galleys subsequently departed from La Rochelle, carrying what he described as the whole treasury of Hugues de Perrot, one of the order's highest officials. Historical debate continues regarding the reliability of this testimony. De Chalon provided no eyewitness confirmation of the ship's departure. His knowledge was secondhand. The number 18 seems suspiciously specific for a detail he could not have verified. Moreover, modern analysis questions whether the Templars possessed a fleet of such size. Records from La Rochelle indicate the order maintained 2 cargo vessels for wine export, not an armada of warships. Yet the testimony persists in trial documents, suggesting the interrogators considered it significant enough to record. What can be established through cross-referencing multiple sources? The arrest orders were sealed on September 14, 1307, providing approximately 4 weeks before execution on October 13. This window allowed for preparation. Port records from La Rochelle, fragmentary though they are, show unusual activity in late September and early October. Ships departing with no listed cargo or passengers. Harbor fees paid in advance for vessels that never returned. Maritime historians note that autumn Atlantic crossings were hazardous but not impossible for experienced sailors with capable ships. The geographic logic of flight points toward specific destinations. Regions outside immediate French control included Portugal, where King Denis the Rhine refused to persecute Templars, Germanic territories fragmented among competing princes, and Scotland, where Robert Bruce's excommunication placed his kingdom beyond papal jurisdiction. Scotland offered additional advantages: established Templar properties dating from 1128, maritime connections through Atlantic trade routes, and a king desperate for experienced military professionals. Timeline reconstruction based on sailing capabilities suggests vessels departing La Rochelle in early October could reach Scottish waters by late October or early November 1307. Medieval ships designed for Mediterranean and coastal navigation typically sailed at 4 to 6 knots under favorable conditions. The distance from La Rochelle to Scotland's western approaches approximated 800 nautical miles, roughly 14 days sailing time, accounting for necessary coastal stops and weather delays. The Sound of Jura represented the primary navigational approach into Argyll. This narrow passage between Jura and the mainland provided sheltered access to Loch Sween, where Castle Sween commanded strategic approaches. Archaeological analysis of the castle's construction phases reveals modifications during the early 14th century, employing techniques characteristic of Crusader fortification. Innovations in defensive architecture developed during decades of warfare in the Levant. Documentary silence regarding arrivals is itself significant. Royal Scottish records for this period are notably incomplete. Edward II of England, in correspondence preserved at the National Archives, explicitly noted that properties in Scotland were beyond his authority since Robert the Bruce controlled that kingdom. English chroniclers mention rumors of Templars fleeing to Scotland, but provide no details, perhaps because they had none, perhaps because acknowledging Templar refuge in Scotland would grant legitimacy to Bruce's rebellious regime. The first potential public emergence of these phantom knights occurs at the Battle of Bannockburn on June 23–24, 1314. Contemporary accounts describe the battle's climax. As Scottish schiltrons pressed forward, a fresh force appeared on the Scottish flank. English chroniclers describe them as a host of men, whose sudden arrival caused panic among English cavalry. Scottish sources are more circumspect, referring simply to reserves. Legend, persistent throughout Scotland, identifies them as Templars, knights wearing white mantles and red crosses, appearing at the decisive moment, their charge breaking English formations and turning near defeat into victory. No contemporary chronicle explicitly confirms this, but none definitively refutes it either. The identity of the flanking force remains one of the battle's enduring mysteries. What is documented? Robert Bruce rewarded his supporters with lands and titles following Bannockburn. Among beneficiaries were families, the Sinclairs, Setons, Stuarts, known to have had connections to the Templar order before its suppression. The systematic erasure of Scottish Templars from historical record was not accidental, but resulted from deliberate acts by multiple parties with overlapping motives. When scholars attempt to trace the order's presence in Scotland between 1307 and the mid-14th century, they encounter not merely absence of documentation, but evidence of active suppression. Monastic cartularies display suspicious discontinuities. At several Scottish abbeys with known Templar connections, folios covering crucial years are missing, removed with deliberate precision, leaving visible stub edges where parchment was excised from bindings. At Melrose Abbey, the cartulary shows complete entries through 1306, then a gap encompassing 1307–1320, followed by resumed documentation from 1321 onward. Similar patterns appear at Holyrood, where the years 1308–1318 are absent from registers that otherwise maintain continuous records. These were not random losses to decay or negligence. Paleographic analysis reveals the missing sections were cut from intact manuscripts, pages deliberately removed, not deteriorated through age. Royal Scottish records present analogous anomalies. The Exchequer rolls documenting Crown revenues display incomplete entries for properties that should have generated consistent income. Former Templar estates officially transferred to the Knights Hospitaller show gaps in revenue documentation, precisely during the period when Templar refugees would have been most active. Yet evidence from later decades confirms these properties remained productive agricultural and commercial operations, suggesting revenue was collected but not recorded in surviving documents. English administrative records provide external corroboration of Scottish silence. In January 1308, King Edward II issued orders to arrest Templars in England, Ireland, and Scotland. The order explicitly noted that Scottish properties were beyond his authority, due to Robert Bruce's control. English chroniclers, including Walter of Gisborough, mention rumors of Templars fleeing to Scotland but provide no substantiating details. This absence is itself revealing. English sources had strong propaganda incentives to document Scottish acceptance of heretical Templars, yet produced no concrete evidence. Church archives reveal perhaps the most telling silences. Bishops' registers recording ordinations, ecclesiastical appointments, and disciplinary matters show gaps in several Scottish dioceses during the crucial period. The register for the Diocese of St. Andrews, which included Templar properties in Fife, lacks entries for 1308–1315. Paleographic analysis of surviving sections reveals signs of alteration, passages scraped away using pumice or blade, text overwritten, dates modified. In one documented instance, a marginal note in a 13th century hand references the Brothers of the Temple at Ballintrodoch, but the passage it annotates has been obliterated. The note survived because it was written in the margin, overlooked by whoever systematically removed references to the Templars from the main text. These are not random losses, but targeted removals designed to obscure specific information. Comparison with records from other regions reveals the deliberateness of Scottish suppression. In England, Templar trial proceedings were documented extensively, despite being ultimately inconclusive. In France, inquisitorial records provide extensive detail about arrests, interrogations, and executions. In Iberian kingdoms, The transition of Templars into other orders was bureaucratically recorded, but in Scotland, silence. Not the silence of absence, but of erasure. Archival researchers have identified telltale signs of this editing. Discoloration on pages indicates where text once existed. Faint impressions from facing pages show words no longer present. References in indices catalog documents that no longer exist in the collections they supposedly describe. These are the fingerprints of historical redaction, work performed by hands that moved through archives systematically removing evidence. The question of who performed this erasure admits several answers. Some censorship appears contemporary to events, Scottish ecclesiastical authorities demonstrating compliance with papal directives while actually protecting refugees. Other redactions date to later periods when Scotland sought legitimacy within wider European community and could not afford association with condemned heretics. The Reformation brought additional destruction as Protestant reformers purged monastic libraries, often failing to distinguish between objectionable religious content and historical records. Each layer of censorship compounded others, creating gaps within gaps, absences obscuring earlier absences. What remains is a documentary landscape marked by shadows, where what is not said speaks louder than what appears in surviving texts. The silence between the lines tells its own story. Something happened in Scotland involving the Knights Templar, something significant enough that multiple generations of record keepers felt compelled to conceal it. The fragmented nature of surviving records reveals not a single suppression narrative, but multiple parallel histories that cannot be reconciled without acknowledging deliberate alteration. French sources dominated by inquisitorial proceedings portray Templars as defeated heretics whose order was righteously destroyed. English chronicles present them more sympathetically as victims of French aggression whose properties were unjustly seized. Scottish sources, or rather the absence of substantial Scottish sources, suggest something else entirely: absorption rather than destruction, transformation rather than elimination. Mapping these divergent accounts geographically reveals patterns illuminating what official histories obscure. In France, the density of Templar commanderies and thoroughness of Philip IV's persecution created extensive documentation. Modern historians have compiled databases of arrest records, trial testimonies, and property seizures covering hundreds of individual Templars. Yet anomalies appear even in France. Port records from La Rochelle show unusual departures in September and early October 1307, ships leaving with undocumented cargo, harbor fees paid for vessels that never returned. Maritime historians note that autumn Atlantic crossings were hazardous, but feasible for experienced sailors. Ships departing French Atlantic ports could reach Scotland in approximately 2 weeks under favorable conditions. The Templars possessed such ships, vessels designed for transporting wine, supplies, and personnel between European holdings in the Mediterranean. While not warships, these cargo vessels were seaworthy enough for coastal navigation and short open water passages. English records document arrests beginning January 1308, but explicitly note Scotland's exclusion. Correspondence from Edward II to his sheriffs, preserved at the National Archives, orders seizure of Templar properties in our realm, specifically stating that properties in Scotland were beyond his authority, since Robert Bruce controlled that kingdom. English chroniclers mention rumors of Templars fleeing northward but provide no details. Perhaps lacking information, perhaps finding acknowledgement of Scottish refuge diplomatically inconvenient. The Scottish documentary situation presents the greatest challenge. What survives are primarily property records, showing transfers of former Templar estates to the Knights Hospitaller, as mandated by papal decree. Archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests these transfers were often nominal. At Mary Coulter in Aberdeenshire, a former Templar preceptory officially granted to Hospitallers, the site continued to be called the Temple in local records for centuries. Similar patterns appear at Temple itself in Midlothian, at Blantyre, and at multiple sites. Place names preserve memory that official documents suppress. Architectural analysis reveals another layer of hidden history. Several properties underwent significant modification in the early 14th century. New fortifications, expanded chapels, residential quarters built in styles consistent with military religious architecture. At Temple in Midlothian, ground-penetrating radar surveys revealed building foundations beneath and around the existing church that predate documented Hospitaller occupation but post-date the original Templar preceptory. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from these structures returned dates between 1310 and 1340, precisely when official records claim no Templar activity occurred. The architectural layout matches design principles documented at Templar commanderies in France and the Levant, including specific orientations, proportional relationships between structures, and defensive features characteristic of military religious architecture. Comparison of carved symbols across suspected Templar sites reveals coordinated activity by craftsmen working to common templates. At Rosslyn Chapel, built beginning in 1446, carvings include motifs found at earlier Templar sites, implying transmission of artistic tradition across generations. At Kilmartin and elsewhere, gravestone iconography shows evolution of Templar symbolism into forms recognizable to specialists but opaque to casual observers. The signature of a tradition going underground, preserving identity through encoded references while avoiding explicit declarations. The divergent histories begin to converge when viewed not as contradictory, but as complementary perspectives on a complex event. French sources document destruction. English sources document exclusion of Scotland from that destruction. Scottish sources document absorption and transformation. Together they map a process by which an international military order, officially dissolved, continued to exist in fragmented form, destroyed in some regions, driven underground in others, and reconstituted under new identities in places where political circumstances permitted. Scotland represented one such place. The evidence is written in different scripts, buildings constructed when they should not have been, symbols persisting when they should have been forgotten, silences speaking of deliberate concealment, and legends preserving memory when official history does not. The suppression of the Knights Templar was not merely a matter of arrests and executions, but a systematic campaign to erase their institutional memory and appropriate their accumulated knowledge. What made the order dangerous to secular rulers was not solely their wealth or military power, but the knowledge infrastructure they had developed over 2 centuries. Templars maintained extensive archives at their Paris headquarters and regional preceptories, including financial records, correspondence networks, maps of the Holy Land and surrounding regions, diplomatic intelligence, and ritual texts governing internal practices. When Philip IV's agents seized the Paris Temple on October 13, 1307, securing these archives was a primary objective. French royal inventories from the period list confiscated documents but also note significant gaps, records that should have existed but were not found, suggesting preemptive removal. What knowledge did Templars possess requiring suppression? Financial records alone would have devastated multiple European monarchs who owed the order substantial debts. Correspondence files documented political dealings, secret alliances, and compromising information about royal and ecclesiastical figures. The order's prolonged presence in Jerusalem gave them access to sites and texts unavailable to others. Templars occupied the Temple Mount, headquarters built over ruins traditionally identified as Solomon's Temple, from 1119 to 1187. Archaeological investigations in the 19th century confirmed that Templars excavated beneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque during their early years. British survey teams in 1867 discovered tunnels beneath the Temple Mount, bearing marks consistent with Templar occupation, finding artifacts including spurs and weapons. Whether excavations yielded ancient manuscripts, sacred relics, or documents containing alternative religious interpretations remains speculative. What is documented? Medieval and Renaissance writers claimed Templars discovered ancient texts beneath the Temple Mount, including materials predating Christianity or containing interpretations challenging Orthodox doctrine. While such claims cannot be verified, they reflect contemporary beliefs that the order possessed knowledge deemed heretical by ecclesiastical authorities. The charges brought against Templars in 1307 centered on allegations of secret initiation rites. Accused knights under torture described ceremonies involving symbolic denial of Christ, spitting near the cross, and worship of an idol called Baphomet. Modern analysis recognizes these confessions as products of torture and leading questions designed to produce predetermined conclusions. Yet the accusations reveal what inquisitors feared, that the order maintained parallel traditions outside church control. In Scotland, if Templar refugees brought archives, what happened to those documents? No collection of Templar manuscripts has ever been discovered in Scotland, yet transmission of specific symbols, architectural motifs, and organizational structures suggests knowledge transfer occurred. Rosslyn Chapel, built by the Sinclair family who had documented Templar connections, contains carvings scholars have linked to Templar, Masonic, and esoteric traditions. The chapel's designer clearly possessed architectural knowledge and symbolic vocabularies that should not have been available in 15th century Scotland, unless preserved and transmitted secretly. Geographic distribution of post-suppression Templar symbolism reveals patterns suggesting organized preservation of tradition. Sites across southern Scotland, from Kilmartin in the west to Temple in the east, display carved stones and architectural elements from the early 14th century onward employing consistent symbolic vocabularies. This is not random convergence, but evidence of shared knowledge maintained across generations. The maritime component adds another dimension. Templars operated ships for 2 centuries, transporting personnel, supplies, and financial instruments across the Mediterranean and Atlantic. They possessed navigational knowledge accumulated through sustained maritime operations, knowledge of currents, weather patterns, coastal landmarks, and safe harbors. Medieval navigation relied heavily on accumulated experience, transmitted through training rather than written records. If Templar ships reached Scotland's western coast, they brought not merely refugees but professional mariners familiar with Atlantic navigation. The Western Highlands maritime culture, dominated by clan galleys and Norse-influenced seafaring traditions, could have absorbed Templar nautical expertise without leaving obvious documentary traces. Knowledge transmitted through apprenticeship and practice rather than written manuals leaves minimal historical footprint. The conspiracy was not that Templars were heretics, modern scholarship has thoroughly debunked the charges against them, but that they represented an alternative locus of knowledge and authority outside church and crown control. Their suppression was an act of institutional consolidation, asserting that no organization could operate with the independence Templars had enjoyed. That some escaped to Scotland, carrying archives and traditions, represented ongoing threat to this consolidation. The survival of Templar traditions in Scotland required transformation. Men who wore white mantles emblazoned with red crosses could no longer display such identification without inviting arrest, even in kingdoms beyond immediate papal authority. The process by which warrior monks became something else, knights in service to Scottish lords, members of other religious orders, landowners whose military past went unrecorded, left traces in landscape and material culture of medieval Scotland. Geographic distribution of suspected Templar absorption sites reveals a network aligned with Scotland's power centers and defensive requirements. Robert Bruce's power base lay in southwestern Scotland, Carrick, Annandale, Galloway, regions where Templar properties had existed before 1307. Bannockburn was fought near Stirling, controlling the gateway to the Highlands. Templar holdings at Temple in Midlothian, at Mary Coulter in Aberdeenshire, and at multiple sites in the borders positioned them along primary invasion routes from England. Archaeological evidence supports this strategic interpretation. Fortifications at former Templar sites show enhancement in the early 14th century, using construction techniques documented at Templar castles in the Crusader states. These modifications employed specialized military engineering knowledge, innovations in defensive architecture including concentric walls, optimized firing positions, and sophisticated water systems characteristic of Levantine fortress design. Maritime connections provide additional threads. The Western Highlands geography, deep sea locks, protected anchorages, island chains, created natural harbors accessible to vessels crossing from France. Kilmartin, with its concentration of enigmatic grave slabs, lies in a region dominated by maritime culture where Norse, Irish, and Scottish influences overlapped. The carved stones there include maritime symbols alongside military imagery, suggesting a population connected to seaborne networks. Trade routes and monastic networks facilitated diffusion of Templar traditions across subsequent generations. Scottish monasteries maintained connections with continental houses, exchanging correspondence, monks, and manuscripts. Several Scottish abbeys were affiliated with Cistercian or Augustinian orders that had maintained close relationships with Templars before suppression. When Templar refugees entered religious life under different identities, they brought architectural knowledge, manuscript illumination techniques, and symbolic vocabularies developed over 2 centuries. The 15th century saw emergence of institutions claiming Templar heritage. Rosslyn Chapel, begun in 1446 by William Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, displays elaborate carvings scholars have linked to Templar traditions and Masonic symbolism. The Sinclair family had documented connections to Templars before 1307. Oral traditions claim they sheltered Templar refugees, though documentary evidence remains elusive. The chapel demonstrates that by the mid-15th century, Templar identity had transformed from condemned heresy to heritage worth claiming. Freemasonry's emergence in Scotland provides another possible vector for tradition survival. The earliest documented Masonic lodges appeared in Scotland during late 16th and early 17th centuries, but Masonic historians argue traditions predate formal documentation. Several Scottish lodges claimed Templar descent, incorporating rituals and symbols reflecting medieval military religious traditions. While direct institutional continuity from Templars to Freemasons cannot be proven, symbolic overlap is striking. Both organizations used architectural metaphors, emphasized moral instruction through allegorical ritual, maintained hierarchical degrees of initiation, and employed symbols, square, compass, temple, common to both traditions. If Templar knowledge survived in Scotland, craft guilds and proto-Masonic organizations would have been logical repositories, operating semi-publicly, but keeping internal traditions from outsiders. Geographic analysis reveals another pattern. Sites across southern Scotland showing evidence of post-1307 activity by individuals with Templar training cluster along specific routes. These align with both defensive positions valuable to Bruce's military campaigns and with pilgrimage routes connecting religious sites. The overlap suggests deliberate positioning, former Templars integrating into Scotland's military infrastructure while maintaining connections to ecclesiastical networks. The survival mechanism appears to have been decentralized. Rather than maintaining a unified underground organization, Templar refugees dispersed into various roles and institutions, preserving fragments of knowledge and tradition that could be transmitted through apprenticeship, family networks, and craft associations. This distributed approach made suppression difficult. There was no single organization to target, no central leadership to eliminate. The pattern resembles biological survival strategies. When an organism cannot survive in its current environment, it adapts, fragments, evolves into new forms better suited to prevailing conditions. Similarly, knowledge deemed too dangerous in 13th century France was not destroyed but transformed, emerging in more acceptable forms across subsequent centuries. Architectural innovations, craft traditions, symbolic vocabularies, organizational structures. The breakthrough in understanding Scottish Templar absorption came not from a single dramatic discovery, but from cumulative weight of evidence assembled through modern interdisciplinary collaboration. For centuries, scattered references to Templars in Scottish legends, architectural anomalies at sites like Rosslyn Chapel, and enigmatic grave slabs at Kilmartin were treated as isolated curiosities or dismissed as romantic mythology. The turning point came when researchers began applying methodologies from forensic archaeology, statistical analysis, and comparative symbolism to interrogate gaps in historical record as rigorously as documents themselves. Statistical analysis proved particularly revelatory. By compiling comprehensive databases of Templar personnel documented in French, English, and Scottish records before 1307, and comparing these with arrest records, execution records, and transfers to other orders, researchers identified a significant demographic anomaly. At least 335 Templars, who should have been captured in initial French arrests, are unaccounted for in subsequent records. They did not appear in trials, were not pensioned off, did not transfer to hospitallers, left no death records. Statistical modeling of escape routes, based on known Templar holdings, maritime capabilities, and geography of regions where persecution was less intense, identified Scotland as one of the most probable destinations. Further analysis of military demographics required for the Battle of Bannockburn, particularly the appearance of trained cavalry capable of executing the decisive flank charge, suggested that incorporating 29 to 48 experienced Templar knights and sergeants would have been strategically significant. Archaeological excavation provided physical corroboration. At Temple in Midlothian, ground-penetrating radar surveys revealed building foundations beneath and around existing church that predate documented hospitaller occupation, but postdate original Templar preceptory. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from these structures return dates between 1310 and 1340, precisely the period when official records claim no Templar activity occurred. The architectural layout matches design principles documented at Templar commanderies in France and the Holy Land, including specific orientations, proportional relationships between structures, and defensive features characteristic of military religious architecture. These were not local builders copying generic monastic layouts, but professionals applying specialized knowledge of Templar architectural tradition. Linguistic and symbolic evidence provided final pieces. Paleographers examining carved stones at Kilmartin and elsewhere identified specific letter forms and symbolic elements traceable to Templar contexts. Straight swords incised on anonymous graves are depicted with details, crossguard shapes, pommel styles, blade proportions, matching weapons documented in Templar inventories. Some stones display partially effaced inscriptions. Advanced imaging techniques revealed traces of letters beneath surface weathering and deliberate obliteration. Reconstructed fragments include phrases in Latin using formulae documented in Templar liturgical texts. The inscriptions were not worn away by time, but deliberately damaged, likely during periods when Templar associations became dangerous, yet not completely destroyed, as if those performing damage were conflicted, unwilling to fully erase memory of those buried beneath. Cross-referencing architectural, archaeological, and symbolic data created a map of Templar influence in Scotland far more extensive than previously understood. Sites across southern and eastern Scotland show evidence of post-1307 activity by individuals with Templar training. The pattern is not random but strategic, concentrated along defensible positions, near royal strongholds, and at locations crucial for Robert Bruce's military campaigns. Yet modern institutions resist full acknowledgement. The Catholic Church, having defended the legitimacy of the order's suppression for centuries, remains reluctant to recognize evidence that Templars escaped and continued functioning under different identities. Official church statements emphasize that Pope Clement fears dissolution was final, and that claims of continuity represent romantic fiction rather than historical fact. Government heritage agencies face similar tensions. Historic Environment Scotland manages sites where Templar presence is suspected, but permits for excavation have been denied or restricted. Ground-penetrating radar surveys that could resolve questions about hidden structures beneath temple or other sites have faced bureaucratic obstacles, suggesting institutional discomfort with potentially disruptive discoveries. The revelation is not that Templars fought at Bannockburn, that remains probable but unprovable, but that they were systematically integrated into Scotland's military infrastructure over decades, bringing expertise in fortification, logistics, mounted warfare, and organizational discipline. This was not a handful of refugees hiding in obscurity, but planned absorption of a defeated military order's assets by a kingdom desperately needing them. The silence in records was not accidental, but the price of their continued existence under Scottish protection. The mystery remains alive, waiting beneath Scottish soil.